I filed the report in 3 parts because no single classification heading covered all of it. The first part was straightforward enough, a routine incident log, the kind our institute generates dozens of per cycle, a field exchange program, a non-solveth participant, an unscheduled interaction, a data capture of anomalous physiological readings. Clean, bureaucratic, the sort of thing that gets reviewed by a junior archivist and shelved without ceremony. The second part required a different heading. I used biological interaction, uncontrolled variable, class 2. That heading exists for situations where a participant in our research environment produces a measurable effect on a solveth subject without deliberate action or prior coordination. We have used it perhaps 9 times in the Institute's 400-cycle history, mostly for contact toxin incidents from species whose skin chemistry we had not fully mapped, twice for sound frequency events, one species that communicated at a register that caused involuntary muscle relaxation in our staff, once for an olfactory event I will not detail here. The third part I classified at restricted access, Tier 4, which requires director authorization to open. Director Vethorin authorized it the same cycle I submitted it. She read it twice, set the data tablet down on the long edge of her work surface, and sat with her hands flat on the table for a considerable time before she spoke. What she said was, he did not know he was doing it. It was not a question. I told her that was correct. He had no awareness at the time that anything of significance had occurred. I had confirmed this through debrief. He had moved across the room, placed his hand on a colleague's shoulder for approximately 20 seconds, said something quiet, and returned to his workstation. When I interviewed him afterward, he described it as simply what you do when someone is having a bad moment. His words, translated as closely as I can render them. You go over there. You don't think about it. Director Vethorin picked up the tablet again. She read the 3rd section a 3rd time. Then she said, file it, Tier 4, no cross-index to the exchange program records. That was the end of the meeting. I am writing this account now, 6 months after that meeting, because Director Vethorin has given me permission to set down a full narrative for the Institute's internal research archive, not for publication, not for the exchange program's oversight body, for us. For the xenobiologists who will come after us and need to understand, in full, what we actually encountered, not the sanitized incident log, not the restricted 3rd section with its stripped-down data tables and carefully neutral language, but the whole sequence, from the morning Harlan Voss arrived at Outpost Keth 7 to the afternoon. I sat in Director Vethorin's office and watched her read. I will try to be precise. It matters that I am precise. The thing we recorded did not happen because of drama or circumstance or unusual conditions. It happened in a routinely lit, temperature-stable, equipment-nominal research bay on an unremarkable Tuesday. That is the part that stays with me. The exchange program had been running for 11 cycles by the time Outpost Keth 7 was included. The premise was straightforward. Solveth Institute staff and staff from a small number of affiliated non-Solveth institutions would rotate through each other's field stations for short-term knowledge transfers. 3 to 6 months. Practical focus, comparative anatomy, cross-species medical methodologies, field triage protocols. Nothing classified. Nothing involving active research subjects. The idea was that exposure to how different species approach the biological sciences would sharpen our own methods. The program had produced, to that point, a modest literature of interspecies methodological comparisons and a handful of equipment adaptations. It was considered mildly useful. It was not considered important. Our station director at the time, not Vethorin, who took the directorship later, the previous director, a thorough man named Keth Salvar, had accepted the exchange arrangement with the polite, moderate enthusiasm appropriate to something you believe will generate paperwork and occasional inconvenience, but cause no actual harm. I shared that assessment. I was the senior xenobiologist assigned to host the exchange participant and integrate them into the station's daily research rhythm. I had done it twice before. A Voreth comparative physiologist, whose methods I found overly intuitive and whose coffee analog beverage smelled like a chemical reagent. A Marath epidemiologist, meticulous and quiet, who had been excellent company, and who had contributed a genuinely useful calibration note to our tissue preservation protocols before she left. Harlan Voss was the third. He arrived on a standard transport shuttle, which docked at our outpost's external bay on a morning I remember as unremarkable in every respect. I met him at the internal airlock with the standard intake documents. He was, by my initial assessment, an undistinguished physical specimen, mid-40s by Solvith reckoning of human age cycles, which meant he was neither young nor old by his own species framework. Medium height, medium build, short-cropped dark hair with silver at the temples, which I later learned was a common marker of middle age in humans. His face carried the particular quality I have come to associate with humans who have spent significant time in field medicine, a kind of organized calm, the expression of someone accustomed to situations in which urgent action must be taken without panic, not the flat absence of feeling that you see in some military species, something warmer than that, attentive. He carried a single equipment bag over one shoulder and a smaller case that he identified when I asked as his personal medical kit. He had brought it as a matter of habit, he said. He brought it everywhere. I asked whether the contents were compatible with our biosafety protocols. He set the case on the intake counter, opened it, and let me look through it without objection. Standard field medic supplies, largely wound closure materials, analgesic compounds in a sealed transport case, a diagnostic scanner sized for handheld use that was clearly older than our station's equipment and equally clearly well-maintained. Nothing that violated our protocols. I logged the inventory and handed the case back. He latched it with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done that gesture 10,000 times and gave it no more thought. The intake went smoothly. He reviewed the outpost's protocols without complaint, asked 2 clarifying questions about our biological hazard containment procedures, both questions precise, both showing genuine prior knowledge of containment methodology, and signed the relevant forms in the clear, rounded script that humans use for their written language. His solvith was limited at that point, functional at perhaps the level of a student in the early stages of study, and we conducted the intake in standard, which is the trade language most exchange participants default to. He apologized for the solvith and said he was working on it. He did not seem embarrassed by the limitation. He seemed to regard it as a problem to be solved rather than a deficiency to be managed. When I walked him through the research bays that would form his primary work area for the next 4 months, he moved through the spaces with an easy, unhurried attention. He noted the equipment. He asked the names of the instruments he did not recognize. He did not pretend to know things he did not know, and he did not seem embarrassed by not knowing them. When I explained the function of our primary neural signal array, the large format unit that dominated the eastern wall of the main bay, he listened with the specific quality of attention that I associate with people who are genuinely interested rather than merely polite. He asked about its measurement range, about what we used it for in our daily research, about what it could detect that smaller units could not. His questions were not the questions of someone attempting to demonstrate competence. They were the questions of someone who actually wanted to know. At no point did he seem nervous. I mention this because it was slightly unusual in my experience of exchange participants. Most arrive with some degree of managed anxiety, a new environment, unfamiliar colleagues, the pressure of representing their home institution competently. Even the most experienced researchers I had hosted had carried a certain self-conscious quality in the first days, the low-grade awareness of being observed and evaluated. Voss did not have this. He arrived the way a person arrives at a place they have decided in advance to be comfortable in, not through any effort at projection or performance, but simply because, for whatever reason, new environments did not appear to trouble him. The adaptability I would later understand was occupational. A man who had spent 14 years doing medicine in situations where the environment was frequently hostile and the working conditions frequently inadequate had long since made his peace with walking into rooms he did not fully know. I introduced him to the research team that afternoon. There were 4 of us at the station at that time, plus Director Keth Salvar, who appeared briefly for the introduction and then returned to his administrative work. The team, myself, Dr. Yeth Kavar, senior xenobiologist, my colleague Ethan Saul, junior xenobiologist, specialist in neural tissue response, 3 years out of her graduate program, technically excellent, somewhat reserved. Oren Veth, our analytical equipment lead, not a biologist by training but indispensable for the precision calibration our more sensitive arrays required. And Rathken, a field medic we retained on station for standard occupational health coverage. He was due to rotate out in 6 weeks. I introduce Rathken because his pending departure is relevant to what followed. He was our station medic. When he left, I had already submitted the request for his replacement and been told the replacement would arrive approximately 8 weeks after his departure. A 2-week gap in medical coverage. Keth Salvar had noted this in the schedule with the administrative equivalent of a shrug. The gap was short. Our team was healthy, the work was low risk, and we had emergency medical protocols that could hold for 2 weeks. He had also noted in passing that Voss held a field medical certification current to human standards, which was not equivalent to our medic certification, but was not nothing. Voss himself mentioned his medical background on his 3rd day. He had been helping Oren Veth recalibrate one of the neural signal array units, the kind of iterative technical work that both of them seemed to find satisfying, trading measurements back and forth with the quiet efficiency of people who speak a common technical language regardless of their species. And somehow the conversation had come around to prior work histories. Voss had spent 14 years as a field medic before transitioning to research-adjacent work, he said. He had worked in high-trauma environments, conflict zones primarily, though he had also done a rotation in a mass casualty response context that he described with the flat specificity of someone who has integrated a difficult experience into his understanding of the world without either dramatizing it or suppressing it. Ethan Saul, who was working at the adjacent station during this conversation, did not participate in it. She rarely participated in casual station conversation at that time. I had known her for 2 years, and she was consistently professional, consistently competent, and consistently difficult to reach. Not cold, I want to be accurate here. She was not a cold person. She was precise and self-contained in the way that some scientists are. The inner life kept interior, the professional interface kept separate, the work itself as the primary mode of connection to the world. She was excellent at her work. Her neural tissue response research was methodical and original in equal measure, and she had the patience for the kind of slow, iterative bench work that produces solid findings rather than fast ones. I respected her considerably, even when she was hard to reach. She had recently ended a long-term partnership with a colleague at our main campus, and while she had said nothing about this directly, the change in her was perceptible to anyone who worked alongside her. She was quieter than her usual quiet. She carried herself with the particular careful steadiness of someone managing something they have decided not to show, not performing equilibrium, but maintaining it through conscious effort that had become, after enough practice, almost invisible. Almost. Voss did not know any of this. He had no reason to. He was polite to her, professional, undemanding. He did not push the conversation she declined to enter. He did not seem to take it personally. He simply noted the boundary and respected it, with the natural, undemanding quality of someone who understood, without being told, that people sometimes need space to be what they are without being asked to be otherwise. The weeks passed without incident. The work was good. Voss was a genuinely useful addition to the station, not in the way a brilliant theorist would be, but in the way a skilled, experienced, versatile person is useful when you are a small team doing intensive field work. He could turn his hand to most tasks. He was reliable, and he had the particular gift of knowing when to offer help and when to leave people alone. Orenveth developed an easy working rapport with him that I found efficient and slightly irritating to observe, in the way that effortless competence in others can be irritating when you have had to work hard for your own. Rathken, who had initially regarded Voss with the mild territorial suspicion that resident medics sometimes show toward visitors with medical credentials, had by the end of his rotation come to regard him with something closer to genuine respect. He mentioned in his exit debrief that Voss had caught a calibration error in the station's emergency oxygen supply inventory that could have been significant in an actual emergency. A small thing, the kind of attentiveness that doesn't announce itself. His solveth improved. He studied it in the evenings, I learned, not with any formal curriculum, but by asking people to correct him when he made mistakes, and by practicing the particular syntactical constructions that gave him difficulty until they became automatic. By the 5th week, he was conducting basic conversations at the station in Solveth with a slow, deliberate precision that was clearly hard-won, and which I found I respected more than I would have respected fluency that came easily. Ethan Saul, whose specialty in neural tissue gave her an interest in language acquisition research, corrected his pronunciation of a technical term one morning in a way that was, for her, almost conversational. He thanked her. She went back to her work without ceremony, but she had spoken to him unprompted, which was notable. Then Rathken left, and the 2-week gap began. It happened on the 9th day of the gap. We were running a standard calibration cycle on our primary neural signal monitoring array, the large format unit that Orenveth and Voss had been working on together for the first 2 weeks of Voss's stay. The array had been fully operational since then, but the protocol called for a complete recalibration check every 60 days, and this was the 60-day mark. The procedure required the array to be brought to full operational sensitivity, run through a signal pattern test sequence, and checked against known baseline reference readings. It was not a difficult procedure. Orenveth could have done it alone, but having 2 people on a full array calibration was good practice, and Voss had assisted with it before. Ethan Saul was working at her own station on the far side of the bay. Her work that morning had nothing to do with the calibration. She was running a tissue response assay, slow, methodical bench work that she preferred to do in silence. I was at my own workstation, reviewing intake logs for a new sample batch. The array calibration had been running for approximately 40 minutes when Orenveth called my name. His voice had a particular quality that I have heard in experienced technicians when something has gone wrong in a way they do not yet understand. Not panic. The flat, controlled steadiness of someone who is suppressing the impulse to panic, because panic is expensive and information is not yet available. I looked up. He was standing at the array console, and he was looking not at the console but across the bay at Ethan Saul's workstation. The array is reading a neural anomaly on her station feed, he said. I think she is having an episode. Ethan Saul's neural monitoring profile was logged with the array, as all station personnel's were. The array, in its recalibration sensitivity, had picked up her readings automatically, an artifact of the procedure. And what it was reading was not baseline. I crossed the bay to her. She was seated at her workstation, hands flat on the surface in front of her, head inclined slightly forward. Her crest, the dorsal neural expression ridge that Solveth carry as part of our biosignaling architecture, was compressed, which in our physiology is associated with acute pain or severe stress. Her respiration was irregular. When I reached her and spoke her name, she looked up, and her eyes were the eyes of someone in the middle of something she is trying very hard not to show. I knew then what I was seeing. I had seen it before, in graduate students and in junior colleagues who pushed themselves past the signals. It was a neural pressure episode. In solveth physiology, these arise when the neural architecture responsible for sustained concentration under stress reaches a threshold it cannot maintain. The result is a cascade, pain originating in the deep tissue nodes behind the crest, radiating through the upper body, accompanied by a disorientation that can range from mild to severe. It is not dangerous in a medical sense. It does not cause lasting damage if properly managed, but it is acutely unpleasant. The standard protocol was rest, specific frequency low stimulus light exposure, and if available, a compound called VETH4 that suppressed the neural signaling cascade and brought the episode to a controlled end within about 30 minutes. We were 9 days into our medical coverage gap. Rathken was gone. Our VETH4 supply was in the medic's cabinet in the medical bay, which was locked, not because access was particularly restricted, but because that was where supplies were kept, and I was not the one who held the daily key rotation. I turned to say Orenveth's name, to ask him to retrieve the key from Keth Salvar's office, and when I turned, Voss was already walking across the bay toward us. He was not running. He was not moving with urgency in a way that would have suggested he understood what he was seeing. He moved the way he had moved through every task I had watched him perform, with purposeful, unhurried directness. He had been at the array console with Orenveth. He had seen the readings on Orenveth's display. Whether he understood what they meant in solveth physiological terms, I did not know. But he had seen Orenveth's posture, and he had seen me cross the bay, and he had done what I would later learn he described as simply following the direction of the room. He stopped at Ethan Saul's workstation on my left. He looked at her for a moment, the assessing, non-intrusive look I associated with his medical training, the look that takes in information without projecting onto it. Then he said, in the careful, accented solveth he had been slowly acquiring over his weeks at the station, "Is it pain?" Ethan Saul looked at him. A long moment passed. Then she nodded once, a minimal acknowledgement, the kind she made when words were expensive. Voss said, "All right." He shifted to stand beside her rather than in front of her, not crowding, alongside. And then, without ceremony, without asking permission, with the absolute matter-of-fact ease of someone doing something so obvious it does not require discussion, he placed his right hand on her left shoulder. His hand rested there. That was all. It rested on the fabric of her work tunic at the junction of her shoulder and the base of her neck, not gripping, not applying pressure, simply present. He did not speak again. He did not look at me. He looked at nothing in particular, or perhaps at the middle distance. The directed absence of gaze that I have come to understand is how humans signal that they are available but not intrusive. 23 seconds, by the array's timestamp log. He held that position for 23 seconds. And then I noticed that Ethan Saul's hands, which had been flat and braced on the surface in front of her, with the rigid tension of someone holding themselves together through force of will, had relaxed. I stood there for a moment, not understanding what I was seeing. She was still. Her respiration was smoothing out. The compressed quality of her crest, the pain signal, was easing. Not gone, not immediately, but easing, with the unmistakable quality of genuine physiological change rather than the effortful management of symptoms. She was not holding herself against the episode. The episode was retreating. Voss, who appeared to have noticed the change in her posture, said quietly, "Better." She did not answer immediately. Then she said, in a voice that was steadier than it had any right to be 6 minutes into an unmedicated neural pressure episode, "Something, yes." He nodded. He did not remove his hand for another few seconds, and when he did, it was with the same unhurried quality, a natural withdrawal rather than an abrupt one. He stepped back. He said to me, in standard rather than solveth, Is there something she should take, a medication? I told him there was, but that I needed to get Keth Salvar's key for the supply cabinet. He nodded and said to go ahead, he would stay nearby. I went to get the key. When I came back with the Veth-4 compound, Ethan Saul was sitting upright in her chair with her hands in her lap. Her crest was visible but not compressed. She was looking at her workstation display as though considering returning to work. She looked, in the blunt terms of Solveth physiological presentation, not like someone 30 minutes into a neural pressure episode, but like someone in the early recovery phase after a managed episode. The phase that normally comes after the Veth-4 has run its cycle. She took the compound. She thanked me. She sat quietly for an hour and then, to my mild exasperation, returned to her assay. Voss, by then, had returned to the array console and resumed the calibration with Oren Veth. When I passed him, he looked up and asked whether she was all right. I told him she appeared to be. He said good, in the flat, satisfied tone of someone who has completed a task and returned to his work. I did not understand what I had watched, not then. It was the array data that made me understand, and I did not access it until later that afternoon, when the calibration was complete and the daily incident log required me to note the neural anomaly reading the array had captured on Ethan Saul's monitoring profile. Standard procedure. I pulled up her readings for the episode window. From the time the array had flagged the anomaly to the time her readings returned to baseline, to confirm the episode and document its parameters. What I found in those readings was not standard. A Solveth neural pressure episode in monitoring data has a recognizable signature. The neural signal cascade builds over a period of several minutes, reaches a threshold peak, and then begins a managed descent, either natural, over approximately 2 to 4 hours, or accelerated through pharmacological intervention, over 30 to 45 minutes. The shape of the descent curve is distinctive and well documented. We have years of reference data on it. The curve in Ethan Saul's data did not match either of those patterns. At the 23-second mark in the episode, the mark that corresponded precisely to the second, with the moment Voss had placed his hand on her shoulder, the cascade did not peak and begin a managed descent. It interrupted. The signal pattern shifted. The cascade did not build further. Within 4 minutes of that interruption, her neural pain signaling had dropped to 30% of its peak level. Within 9 minutes, it was at 12%. Within 15 minutes, it was at a level consistent with low-grade residual discomfort rather than an active episode. The Veth-4 she took 30 minutes into the episode, which I had given her while she was already clearly in recovery, showed a mild additional benefit in the final traces, but the primary phase of the episode had already ended before she took it. The compound had essentially finished what the interruption had started. I ran the data a second time, checking the timestamps manually against my own memory of the morning sequence. They matched. The interruption in the cascade had begun at the moment of physical contact. I sat with that for a while. Then I went to find Oren Veth. He was in the equipment bay, logging the calibration results. I told him I needed him to look at the array data from that morning's episode window and confirm what the timestamps showed. I was specific about what I was asking him to look for, the correlation between the physical contact timestamp and the cascade interruption. I did not tell him what I thought it meant. I wanted him to read the data without my interpretation already in his head. He looked at the data for approximately 12 minutes. Then he turned in his chair and looked at me. "That's not possible," he said. I told him the data said otherwise. "What compound does he carry?" he asked, "in the medical kit?" It was a reasonable question and one I had already thought of. A contact transfer compound, something on Voss's skin or his tunic, applied through the contact, that had produced the interruption. That would explain the data without requiring an explanation I was not ready to consider. I went to Voss. I asked him, with what I hoped was clinical neutrality, whether he had applied anything to his hands or skin that morning, a medical compound, a topical application, anything that might have transferred on contact. He thought about it carefully, the way he thought about things that deserved careful thought, and said no. He had washed his hands before starting the calibration, standard procedure when working with sensitive array equipment. Nothing else. He asked whether there was a problem, whether Ethan Saul was all right, and I told him she was fine and that I was completing the incident log. He accepted this without suspicion or particular curiosity. He did not seem to feel that anything notable had happened. He had gone over there, placed his hand on her shoulder, and helped with a colleague's difficult moment. It was, in his evident reckoning, no more complicated than that. I tested his hands. I ran a chemical contact screen on the right palm, the hand he had used, under the pretense of a routine exchange participant health check, which is a real protocol and which he had no reason to question. The screen came back clean of all known solvent-active compounds. I tested his tunic fabric. Clean. There was nothing on him. Orenveth and I spent the rest of that evening going through the data from every angle we could find. We looked at instrument error, whether the array's recalibration sensitivity state had introduced a measurement artifact. Orenveth knew that array better than anyone at the station, and he was methodical and unsparing in his examination of the possibility. He ran the array's diagnostic log for the entire calibration window. He checked the signal processing chain at each stage. He looked at the reference signal baseline that the calibration had established and compared it to the anomaly readings, looking for any sign that the elevated sensitivity had created a false signal by amplifying ambient noise into a pattern that resembled a real physiological reading. His conclusion was given to me without hedging. The sensitivity state did mean the array was capturing data at higher resolution than normal, but that did not explain an artifact of this pattern. The pattern was too specific, too internally consistent, too perfectly correlated with a real external event to be noise amplification. This was not a ghost signal. This was a real reading of real physiological change. We looked at spontaneous episode resolution, the rare but documented phenomenon of a solvent neural pressure episode self-limiting without intervention. It happens in perhaps 4% of cases, in episodes at the lower end of the severity spectrum, and even in those cases the resolution timeline is measured in hours, not minutes. Ethan Saul's episode had not been at the lower end. The array's reading of her initial cascade had placed it in the middle to upper range. Spontaneous resolution at that severity, within the time frame we had observed, was outside the documented range. Not impossible, technically, but at a frequency that the literature characterized as vanishingly rare, rare enough that designing a research study around it would require sample sizes no institution could practically achieve. And spontaneous resolution, when it did occur, did not produce a cascade interruption signature at a specific, discrete moment in time corresponding to an external physical event. It produced a gradual plateau and fade, a natural exhaustion of the cascade's own energy, the biochemical equivalent of a fire burning down rather than being put out. What we had in Ethan Saul's data was not a fire burning down. It was a clean interruption. The cascade had been heading in one direction, and then it had changed direction, and the change corresponded with a precision that was almost unsettling to a discrete, identifiable external event. At a specific second, 23 seconds after contact. I wrote up my preliminary findings in a personal research note that night. I did not yet know what I was going to do with it. I was not yet certain, in the particular way that scientists become uncertain when the data points towards something they are not prepared to process, what the findings actually meant. I knew the correlation. I did not know the mechanism. Without the mechanism, I had, technically, a correlation and an absence of alternative explanations, which is not the same as a positive finding, and which would not survive peer review in its current form. But I am a xenobiologist. My entire career has been built on the premise that other species biology will surprise you if you look carefully enough. I have found things in the comparative physiology literature that colleagues at other institutions described as anomalies, and I described as data. I have learned to sit with data that I cannot yet explain rather than explaining it away prematurely. I am not prone to motivated skepticism in the direction of comfortable conclusions, and I have no patience for the kind of intellectual caution that is actually intellectual cowardice dressed in the language of rigor. The next morning, I reviewed the existing literature on human tactile physiology. Our institute's library held a moderate collection of human biological research, enough for the exchange program's reference needs, not a comprehensive collection by any measure. I started with what I knew. Humans are a physically contact-active species. They communicate through touch in ways that many species do not. They maintain physical proximity with trusted individuals as a form of social bonding. They are, compared to most of the species in our research database, unusually high contact, not universally, not without individual and cultural variation, but as a species-level tendency, the data was clear. Physical contact between humans who hold a positive social relationship is frequent, broadly distributed across interaction types, and largely unremarkable to them. They shake hands at greetings. They place hands on shoulders, on arms, on the backs of chairs behind their colleagues. They embrace at arrivals and departures. They do this without apparent strategic calculation. It is simply what they do. None of this was new. It was documented. It was considered a behavioral characteristic, culturally inflected, variable across individual humans and across human communities. The xenobiological literature treated it primarily as a social structure element, something to note in field observation protocols, something to be aware of when designing joint research environments so that unintended contact with non-human colleagues could be managed appropriately. No different, in the literature's framing, than noting that some species communicated through pheromone gradients or postural display. I had read this literature. I had applied it practically in my exchange hosting. I had made a note in Voss's intake file to the effect that human participants might initiate contact gestures that were standard within their social framework, and that station staff should respond according to their own comfort levels, not according to any perceived offense. Standard guidance. I had given it no more thought than that. What I was now looking for was something beneath the behavioral layer, something in the biochemistry of what the touch itself produced, not in the human making contact, but in the biology of the contact event as a chemical exchange. I found it in a subfield of human neuropharmacology that I had never had cause to read before, the literature on cutaneous thermal emission and its systemic biological effects in human physiology. Human skin generates and radiates heat as a byproduct of metabolic processes. This is not unusual. Many species do. What is somewhat unusual in humans, compared to the other species in our reference database, is the degree to which that thermal emission is integrated with their nervous system's social bonding architecture. Humans, under conditions of close physical contact with an individual they perceive as non-threatening, produce a cascade of endogenous compounds through a mechanism that involves both the heat exchange through skin contact and a neural signaling loop that activates within seconds of that contact. The loop is involuntary. The researchers characterized it as reflexive. It does not require conscious initiation. It occurs because the contact has occurred and the contact is perceived as safe. The compound profile of that cascade was what I spent 3 days reading. And on the third day, I found the paper that changed everything. It was not a recent paper. It was a comparative xenobiology study published 14 years earlier, authored by a team at a Solvith-affiliated research institution on a different world, not our institute, a smaller center I had visited once and not thought about since. The paper's subject was the biochemical properties of a compound in the human cutaneous contact cascade that the researchers had designated H7 for study purposes. The paper was narrowly cited, technically dense, and had never come up in any of my prior work because my prior work had not touched human neurochemistry. H7 had been identified because its molecular structure bore a partial resemblance to a family of synthetic compounds that solveth pharmacologists had been attempting to develop for neural pain management for approximately 60 years at the time of the study. Not the same compound, not even close to the same compound in most respects, but the partial structural homology was enough to flag it for investigation. The structural resemblance was, the paper noted, probably coincidental, a convergent evolutionary outcome rather than a shared lineage, but it was the kind of coincidence that a careful researcher would follow up on. The paper's finding was this: in controlled contact experiments between human volunteers and Solveth subjects, dermal exposure to the H7 compound, transferred through normal skin contact at the concentrations produced during human social bonding proximity, produced a measurable inhibitory effect on Solveth neural pain cascade signaling. The effect was statistically significant. The paper described it as a promising avenue for further investigation and recommended additional trials to characterize the dose-response relationship, the optimal contact duration for therapeutic effect, and the variation in compound output across different human individuals and physiological states. There had been no follow-up study. I checked thoroughly, spending half a day going through the citation records and the research directories of the 5 institutions most likely to have continued the work. The principal researcher had retired. The team had dispersed. The funding cycle that had supported the original study had closed. The research line had not been continued. A promising avenue, identified, flagged as such in the paper's own abstract, and then simply not walked. Perhaps the effect had seemed too narrow, too specific to one species interaction pair. Perhaps the logistical complexity of conducting controlled human-solveth contact trials had made follow-up impractical. Perhaps no one had thought to connect it to the ongoing synthetic compound development work in the pharmacology divisions. For whatever reason, the finding had sat, narrow and uncited, in the archive for 14 years. H7 was produced at baseline concentrations during ordinary human contact, at concentrations above baseline, which the paper characterized as arising when the human was in a state of active social protective engagement with the contact subject. The compound output increased substantially. The paper measured this elevation as a factor of 3 to 4 times baseline concentration. It noted the finding with appropriate scientific neutrality and observed that the mechanism responsible for the elevation remained incompletely characterized. I sat with that sentence for a long time. Active social protective engagement. The authors had meant, in their clinical language, that a human who physically touched another individual out of a genuine impulse to help or comfort produced more H7 than a human who touched another individual in a neutral or transactional context. The compound yield was not just a function of contact. It was a function of the internal state of the person making contact. I thought about Voss crossing the bay, the unhurried purpose of it, the way he had positioned himself alongside rather than in front of her, the quiet, declarative quality of his presence, the way he had looked at nothing in particular, which I now understood was the visible expression of a state I had no better word for than simple, unambiguous care. He had not done any of this deliberately. He had not known he was administering anything. He had gone over there because someone was having a hard time, and going over there was what you did. He had placed his hand on her shoulder, because that was how you let someone know they were not alone in the middle of something difficult. And in doing so, he had transferred, through ordinary skin contact, a compound that no Solveth pharmacologist had ever synthesized at useful concentration levels despite 60 years of trying, at a dosage sufficient to interrupt an active mid-range neural pressure cascade in approximately 23 seconds. The synthesized versions we had attempted, 3 generations of H7 analogs produced in our own institute's chemistry division. I found records of them in the research archive when I looked. Had reached approximately 18 to 22% of the biological activity of the natural compound at the contact concentrations the paper had documented, which meant that even in its natural form, as produced by an ordinary human in an ordinary state of social presence, the compound was at the edge of pharmacological usefulness, but not decisively over it. At elevated concentrations, the concentrations produced by a human in a state of what the paper's authors had termed active social protective engagement, the output was, according to the paper's measurements, 3 to 4 times baseline. I ran the numbers. 3 to 4 times 22% of insufficient was more than sufficient. It was not a theoretical finding anymore. I had a monitoring record of it working. I had timestamps. I had the cascade interruption signature. I had Ethan Saul's recovery curve, which matched, to a degree that made me put the tablet down and breathe deliberately for a moment, the curve that the 14-year-old study had documented in its controlled trials. I wrote the restricted access section of my report. I want to be clear about what the report said and what it did not say. It did not say that human touch was a medical treatment. It did not recommend any clinical application. It did not propose that humans be introduced into solveth medical practice. It said, here is a biological mechanism. Here is an incident that documented it in action. Here is the prior research that described it. Here is why that prior research was probably underpowered, and why no one followed up on it. And here is the range of further investigation that would be required before any meaningful clinical characterization was possible. What the report also said, in the final paragraph of the restricted section, in language I chose carefully, was this: the compound is produced involuntarily, in response to an internal state rather than deliberate action, at concentrations that vary with the intensity of that state. It cannot be reproduced by a human who knows what they are doing and attempts to produce it on demand, because the production mechanism is not a voluntary process. The 14-year-old study had tested this briefly in a single supplementary trial. Humans who were told about the compound and asked to intentionally produce it during contact showed elevated anxiety, which the paper characterized as suppressing the social bonding state and reducing compound output. The compound is produced when a human is genuinely, unself-consciously trying to help someone feel less alone. It is, in other words, not a skill. It is not a medical technique. It is what humans do when they go over there. Director Vethorin read that paragraph 3 times. What she said, after a long silence, was, he did not know he was doing it. I told her that was correct. She said, does he know now? I told her that I had not informed Voss of the incident's findings. I had completed the incident log with the minimal clinical notation required: neural pressure episode, solveth subject, intervening factor under investigation, and I had not provided him with the analysis. He was still at the station. He had another 6 weeks in his exchange rotation. He was, as far as I knew, unaware that the morning in question had produced anything of scientific note. She asked whether I intended to tell him. I said I was uncertain. She thought about that. Then she said, what would you tell him? That when he helped a colleague, he was also doing something we cannot replicate in a laboratory. I said that was roughly the situation, yes. Then I think, she said carefully, that telling him would change something about how he does it, and I think that would be a loss. I have thought about that observation many times since. I am not certain it is true in every respect. Voss seemed to me like someone whose fundamental qualities were not easily altered by external information, but I understand what she was getting at. There is something in the mechanism itself that makes clinical instrumentalization of it difficult. You cannot train it. You cannot standardize it. You cannot produce it on demand. You can only, if you are a human, apparently mean it. Voss completed his rotation 6 weeks later. He departed on a routine shuttle, the same bay where he had arrived. He had packed his equipment bag with the same unhurried efficiency he brought to everything, and he had made his rounds of the station in the morning, checking in with Oren Veth, reviewing the final notes he wanted to leave on the array calibration documentation, leaving a clear and organized transition summary on the shared workstation for whoever would use his bench next. He was thorough in departures, I suspected, the way people are thorough when they have learned through long experience that untidy departures create work for others. He shook hands with Oren Veth, who had clearly found the whole exchange considerably more valuable than he had expected. Their goodbye had the quality of two technicians who had solved problems together and found the other one worth the bother, a respect built on shared work rather than personal warmth, though the warmth was also there, in the way they both avoided being sentimental about it. He said goodbye to Ethan Saul, who, and I noted this, and it seemed significant to me, though I could not quantify it, actually stopped her work and crossed the bay to see him off, which was not something she had done for any previous departure in my time at the station. She had been at her bench when he had come through to say goodbye. She had stopped. She had stood up from her chair and walked across the bay to where he was standing near the airlock, which was not the shortest route to the door, but was the route that brought him past her workstation. She shook his hand. The contact was brief, 2 seconds, perhaps 3. She said something I could not hear from where I was standing. He nodded, and what he said back was quiet and unremarkable, the kind of thing people say at the end of a good working relationship, not words that need to be recorded. What mattered was that she had crossed the bay, and she had offered her hand, and there had been no ceremony about it, no wait, just a clean, ordinary human farewell and the grip of a hand extended by someone who had decided, at some point in the preceding 4 months, that this person was worth saying a proper goodbye to. I watched the array monitor out of professional habit. I was not proud of this. There was a small, clean signal, below threshold for clinical significance, below anything that would have flagged as anomalous in a normal monitoring context. A brief elevation in her neural signaling baseline, smooth and symmetrical, rising and falling in the time it took for the handshake to occur and for her to step back. He had shaken her hand. He had not known he was doing anything. Voss picked up his bag, picked up the smaller case with the medical kit he had carried everywhere for 14 years of field work, and walked through the airlock. The door sealed behind him. Oren Veth went back to his equipment. Ethan Saul stood at the airlock door for a moment longer than was necessary, looking at the sealed surface, and then she went back to her bench. I went to my workstation and added a note to the restricted section of the report. The note read, "Secondary contact event recorded on day of exchange participants' departure. Duration approximately 2 to 3 seconds. Baseline compound transfer confirmed at subtherapeutic levels. Participant unaware. Nature of mechanism consistent with primary findings." I did not add anything else. There was nothing else to add that the data did not already say. Director Vetharin told me, when she reviewed the note 2 weeks later, that she thought I had described it well. I have not told Ethan Saul what the monitoring record shows. She has never asked. She knows something shifted that morning in the bay, in the way that you know certain things about your own body without being able to name the mechanism. The way you know that some days the work is easier, and some days it is hard, and the days are not always distributed the way the external circumstances would predict. She has returned to her work with a steadiness I cannot characterize clinically, but which seems, to my observation, qualitatively different from the careful steadiness she carried before. She has submitted a research proposal for an expanded neural tissue study. She attended the last 2 interstation conferences, which she had skipped the previous 2 years. Small things, the kind of data that does not belong in a restricted access research file. I will probably not tell her. I'm still not certain whether telling her would be useful, or kind, or accurate to what actually happened, which was that a man from a species we have been studying for 160 cycles walked across a room and placed his hand on her shoulder because someone was having a hard time, and that was what you did. The mechanism is real. The compound is real. The monitoring data is real and sits in our institute's archive behind a Tier 4 access authorization. All of that is true. But I have found, in the months since I filed that report, that the mechanism being named does not fully account for what it was to watch it happen. I have been a xenobiologist for 31 years. I have spent those years under the assumption, reasonable and generally correct, that biology is discoverable, that if you look carefully enough, you will find the mechanism, name the compound, map the signaling pathway, and in doing so understand the thing. I still believe this, largely. The 14-year-old paper found the compound. I found the monitoring evidence. The mechanism is not mysterious. It will be studied, eventually, by people with better resources than our field station possesses, and they will characterize it fully, and it will enter the literature as a documented interspecies pharmacological phenomenon with a proper compound designation, and a dose-response curve, and a clinical application range. And none of that will capture the 23 seconds. The hand on the shoulder, the look at nothing in particular that was actually a way of being present without demanding anything in return. The flat, satisfied good, when he found out she was all right, the tone of someone who had completed a task that needed doing and was now ready to return to the calibration. A task so unremarkable in his own reckoning that it did not require a name or a protocol or a procedure. Someone was having a hard time. You went over there. You didn't think about it. That is in my notes, not in the report. I don't have a classification heading for it.